Hello and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And me, Gareth Tennant.
In this podcast, we're hoping to explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business who compare and contrast their experiences as they attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And this week's podcast is sponsored by a very tall glass of ice cold water because I've just been outside cutting up large piles of wood. So I'm pretty sure we should be going back to something a bit more alcoholic, but maybe next time around. So Gareth, how are you doing since we've spoken last? And I think it's an increasingly important question. Where are you now?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you, Chris. I am back out in Canada. I'm now in Trenton, Ontario.
Very glamorous. Well, look, in today's episode, this is one of the topics that I wanted to talk about. And I was thinking of what to call it. And I came up with what is probably not a brilliant description: creating a route map for your business. And I recognize over now a number of podcasts, we've generally talked at quite a high level about a number of concepts: strategy, vision, plans, culture, all these kinds of things. And one of the things I'm really keen to do is that where possible, we return to something that's sort of practical and you can hold on to. So I know a couple of episodes ago, we talked about Scrum and Agile, and we talked about a particular framework called Scrum. And so today I wanted to turn back to that kind of idea and talk about vision and strategy and planning, but try to bring it out of the abstract into, look, if you were going to do something like this tomorrow, what's a way you might think about it? And the way or the concept I want to introduce is this concept of the BHAG and the 3HAG, which sounds very exciting. Have you ever come across BHAGs and 3HAGs before?
I haven't, no, but I'm quite excited to find out what they are.
I was going to say, so this is something which I don't think is a secret. I don't think it's sort of hidden in the world, but it's not something I'd particularly heard of before. And I came across this just over a year ago. And so this concept that I'll start with, so it kind of goes in an order. There's BHAG and then 3HAG. It'll make more sense in a second. I think the concept of the BHAG has been around for many years, and it will make sense in a second, but you just won't have heard it called a BHAG. So what is a BHAG? A BHAG stands for Big Hairy Audacious Goal. So it's
Big Hairy Audacious Goal.
Big Hairy Audacious Goal. Isn't that fantastic? That's not the kind of acronym you normally expect. So giving it its proper attribution, a gentleman by the name of Jim Collins introduced the concept of Big Hairy Audacious Goal in a 1994 book called Built to Last. And in simple terms, a BHAG is a clear and compelling goal that serves as a unifying focal point of effort, often creating immense team spirit. I love the phrase immense team spirit.
So that's very similar to what we've talked about in terms of the overarching vision when we've mentioned these things in the past.
It absolutely is. And I think there's something about, if you were to say to me what's a little bit different or what's the extra layer of value on top, I think it's the audacious bit.
Okay.
And I'll give you some examples. I think otherwise I end up sort of talking about this in a very abstract way. But just before I do that, secondly, so we said clear, compelling goal, unifying focal point of effort, creating team spirit, all agree. Should be inspiring, long-term. That's sort of a new thing about long-term. And this is a good bit, almost unachievable.
Almost unachievable. Okay.
Yet inspires a team to greatness. So I've given you the context. Now let's actually get to the punchline.
Would I be right in thinking this is similar to when people talk about moonshot?
Well, funny you should say that, because I think the moonshot and the visit to the moon is held up today as an example of a BHAG. So I've got three examples for you. The first one is from Amazon. Every book ever printed in any language, all available in less than 60 seconds.
Okay.
So I
like that. Yeah.
And Exactly. So there's something compelling, there's something exciting, there's something almost unachievable about this. In other words, as it was originally described to me, a BHAG, if you know how you're going to do it, it isn't a BHAG. There's a bunch of problems we're going to have to solve, and we don't even know how to solve those today that we're going to get there. Here's the second one. This is Merck back in the 1930s, transformed the company from a chemical manufacturer into one of the preeminent drug making companies in the world. So we're known as this small thing, and we want to revolutionize what we do and become number one in the world at something that we don't do today, which is worldwide. Interesting, and much more of a sort of a business focus than sort of moonshotty things, but I thought that was good. The last one, and I think this is a highly relevant and good example, and it touches on our friend Elon Musk, who we've talked about once or twice, is enable human exploration and settlement of Mars, SpaceX.
Yeah.
And what I like about that is, again, human exploration and settlement to Mars. That is, for many people, an amazing and sort of, it drives teams to greatness. It's a thing no one's ever done. And there's a perfect example there of, there are multiple things that you would have to figure out how to do first before you can get to do that.
I haven't heard of BHAG before, but I have obviously heard of moonshots and sort of a lot of conversation over the last couple of years about, growth in the UK and developing growth, and perhaps we need to start going after moonshots, and that will create innovative technologies, and those will have a collaborative effect on creating growth, and a lot of conversation around that, which has been quite interesting. But there's a concept that comes from Google, which is counter to a lot of the perceived wisdom around incremental growth. So you hear a lot, came out of British cycling, I think, was this idea of, incremental gains, those marginal gains to become the best at what you do. And that works in a closed system where the rules are fit. Cycling in a competitive race, you can't change the rules, so you can't get on a motorbike and win. So you have to go through, within that closed system, those incremental gains. But of course, business isn't a closed system. You can make innovations and break into that, blue water development where other people are still using old paradigms, old technologies. Google have this concept called 10x, which is the idea that if you want to go into a new market, if you want to do something, you shouldn't try and be 10% better than your competitor. You should try and be 10 times better than your competitor. And the example that somebody from Google once talked me through was when they were looking at pushing adoption of Google technologies in Africa. Most tech companies were looking at, well, how do we get smartphones into the hands of people who don't currently have access to the internet? Well, we'll probably need to lay some fiber optic cables, and we'll need more internet cafes, and Google's approach was, no, don't make it 10% better. Don't incrementally grow market access. Why don't we have satellites in space that beam Wi-Fi? And that led to, the whole Silicon Valley race around providing high bandwidth internet from space, because then you don't need to build fiber optic cables, and you don't need to convince people to open cyber cafes. You literally make it cheap enough that people can just get the internet from space. And it seems like that would be what you would describe as a BHAG goal, perhaps.
Actually, probably. I mean, by the way, we're going to get into what is a BHAG versus not a BHAG, and as we've done on multiple occasions, there's an element of it all being highly theoretical and arguing the point. That what you have described is a highly valid activity, so that's absolutely fine. But actually, I almost want to, not almost, I want to just push back a little bit on that. A BHAG in my mind would be, I want every person in Africa to have access to content I provide.
Yeah.
And the internet that you talked about is a mechanism by which you get there. That's not the thing you're trying to do.
I see what you mean. It's about the articulation of the vision. Yeah.
Correct. And actually, I'll go a little bit further. Actually, just before I was going to talk about, people have talked about what makes a good BHAG. which I think is helpful. But just before, I do want to go back, because I think your story about the UK cycling team, and I am entirely stealing this from Tim Harford, who, if people haven't listened or read Tim Harford, they should. But he talked about these incremental enhancements, and the first example he gave of the UK cycling team was just before they started, the coach would dust down the tires. Yeah. So there was maximum grip. The reason why I bring that up is not for that one, because that's mildly interesting. Actually, it's the other one which excited me, which was electric hot pants. Have you heard the story of the electric hot pants?
Yes, I have actually, but some of our listeners probably haven't, so do tell it anyway.
Well, so today we're talking sort of grand vision, BHAGs, 3HAGs, but I want to reiterate what you said, which is there is room for incremental improvements. There is room within a closed system to say, how can we do something better? And my understanding is it was the coach of the cycling team noticed something kind of interesting. And that was the time for the team to finish the course in the final was often slower than in the semi-final, which of course is counterintuitive. You would think they'd go faster in the final. And as it turns out, the semi-final was typically an hour or half an hour before the final. And what had happened was the team's muscles would cool down and therefore weren't working at peak efficiency. And so what he did was he came up with some electric hot pants, literally, to keep the muscles warm and therefore make sure that when they actually went into the final, the muscles were at optimum temperature. And I love that as a story, frankly, mostly for the phrase electric hot pants. Anyway,
electric hot pants.
To get back
it sounds like a very good punk band from the 1980s.
Yes, I think that has to be a motif as we go through which business terms or ideas would be good bands. Anyway, let's go back to what makes a good BHAG, because I think that helps shape this a little bit. There's a bunch of questions people talk about asking yourself. Do you find this exciting? And I like this because often we talk about clear and concise goals and outcomes. Are the people that work with me going to get excited about it? Like, we are going to go to the moon. That is exciting. That is a mission that people want to get behind. Is it clear, compelling, and easy to grasp? And I know I was about to apologize that we've talked about these concepts before. Guess what? They resonate, they echo through everything we do. This is a good one. Does the BHAG connect to the core purpose? What is the core purpose of the company, and are we aligned to that? Will it be exciting to a broad base of people in the organization, not just those with executive responsibility? Oh, look, it's not just the people in the boardroom, it's the people who are actually on the ground. And is it undeniably a big, hairy, audacious goal? In other words, it's that thing of, have we just described something that would be really quite pleased if we did in the next 3 to 5 years? Or is it literally audacious? And the other example is at a time when IBM used to sell mainframes that took the size of, frankly, a large house, let alone a small room, they said, we want to put a computer on everybody's desk. Okay, that is audacious. That's crazy. Yep. Every computer costs X million dollars. It's a large house. How are you going to do that? It's got to be audacious.
There's a management consultant called John Cotter, who's quite well renowned for transforming organizations and helping them implement strategies. And he's written many books. And he talked about the need for a call to action. And it sounds to me like his description of a call to action, which is clear to everybody in the organization, get people interested and excited about being part of the change, tangible, and I suspect this is where perhaps it may be slightly different from BHAG, is that it's tangible about how you're going to get to that point. Not necessarily, it's clear what the route is, but it's tangibly feasible, I suppose. But he calls it a call to action, but it sounds very similar to a BHAG.
I think it is, and I think what you're touching on is this idea of, because at the moment we're talking moonshot. In fact, there's 3 more things they talk about, and I like this next one because this sounds counterintuitive. Do you believe the organization has a less than 100% chance of achieving it? And actually, and I don't know whether I agree with this. This sounds all very too specific. 50 to 70% chance is ideal, is the statement that they make. But the point about it is, literally, we're not just saying, here is a logical extension of what we're doing, and this is just us defining what the destination is. It's something beyond that. It's something more than that. Will achieving the BHAG require a quantum step in capabilities? And again, I think the IBM, and maybe we'll talk about SpaceX in a second, is a brilliant example. You're insane. The idea that we're going to have a computer on every desktop, this thing's the size of a house. Okay, it's a quantum change in what we're doing that revolutionizes things. And finally, in 25 years, would you be able to tell if you'd achieved the BHAG? And I think what we're trying to do here is just stopping it being, we've sold 100 widgets this year. Can we sell 500 widgets? Or even, dare I say, 1,000? No, that's not a BHAG. The BHAG is, could our widgets influence everybody on the planet? And so I kind of like that. So the challenge here is BHAG, brilliant idea of this beacon in the future. This, what is it we dare to hope for that is going to inspire, excite, and point us in a direction? And we've talked about this before about strategies. Be that torch in the dark that says, are we heading in the right direction? The problem is connecting the long term with the short term. We've talked about going to the moon. How are we going to do that? And so the 3HAG fits in with this, and it sort of perfectly dovetails. So I believe this was a number of years after.
Before you go on to the 3HAG, because I suspect you're going to go from big, hairy, audacious goals in the long term to smaller stepping stones to getting there. And we're probably going to talk a lot about linking strategy to operations and tactics and that kind of stuff. But I want to bring it back into the military field, because ultimately that's what this podcast is all about. I want to explore the idea of audaciousness within the framework of military operations. So conflict, fighting is by its nature a complex endeavor. It's people clashing wills through the use of physical violence, which is a horrendous thing, but it's also a very unpredictable thing. And we talk about in the military the components of fighting power, which is a very sort of managerial speak way of saying what gets people to fight for something they believe in. And the three components of fighting power are quite logically the physical component. What is your capability in terms of weapons that you have, maneuver, in that you have, armored vehicles that can move fast and they're well defended, and so equipment and things. Then you have the conceptual component, which is about your ideas on how you fight and why you fight. So things like doctrine, planning techniques and processes, and a lot of the things we've sort of talked about on this podcast so far would probably fall into that conceptual component. And then finally, the moral component, which is, why do people individually risk themselves and sacrifice their well-being to be part of the fight? And it's the combination of those three things that make a fighting force better than another and gives them a competitive advantage. When you look at something like, let's look at the situation in Ukraine at the moment, we are just coming out of that winter period. The ground is thawing. It's very difficult to maneuver. The situation is such that, tragically, it is a very static, in some places on the line, trench warfare, and neither side seems to be maneuvering or moving or gaining ground. And so both sides are now weighing up what's next. And there is this balance of having to think about capability. And obviously there's lots of talk in the news about ammunition supplies for artillery, and are we going to give them fast jets or not? And we're giving them Western tanks, and have the Russians, are the sanctions preventing them from building tanks? So there's lots of capability conversation. Then there's a bit of conversation, and there's lots of talking heads from ex-military generals on the news, and lots of stuff out on social media about what we think they're going to do in terms of tactics and what's their overall strategy and how are they going to use their Viking power. And there's a lot of conversation about the centralized Russian approach versus the mission command approach of the Ukrainians. And obviously on this podcast, we talked about mission command quite a bit. What isn't talked about quite so much is how you get people to stand up and fight, how you get people to put themselves in harm's way, sometimes deliberately sacrifice their own well-being for the greater good of the operation. And that comes down to that moral component. And I think there is a striking resemblance in the word audacious in a BHAG with the idea of having that strategic vision, but not only having the vision, but being able to get people to rally around it as a senior commander, to get people to say, I would follow that person. I believe, though, even though the odds are stacked against us, even though in terms of, the capability, we are the underdogs. Absolutely. I think we're going to be okay. I think we're going to win here. It's perhaps, I'm perhaps stretching it a little bit, but it seems to me that there is a resemblance between how you articulate your strategic vision as a commander, which is going to be about your conceptual component and your physical component, to the people that are going to have to implement it, which is that moral component. And I think what we would call great leadership and perhaps narrative leadership, the idea of selling the vision, selling the story, is what you're talking about in terms of being audacious.
I think you're right. And as you were talking, I was thinking, and I feel a bit, I think it's a dangerous thing to maybe do this, but what would a Ukrainian BHAG be in this sort of the way we're thinking about it? And I think maybe it's something like, we will remain a sovereign nation free from anyone on our land, or something like that. As you say, it's this higher level. What's interesting though, I was, as you sort of started talking about the military version of the BHAG, I wondered whether I suspect there are many ways you can sort of interpret and describe what your goal is. I could imagine fight anywhere in the world within half an hour's notice. Be anywhere in the or project power to any part of the planet, project overwhelming power to any part of the planet within 24 hours. That's the kind of thing which is like, well, hang on a minute, but we aren't in insert name of place. Well, good. How would we project power there? Well, what do you mean by power? Well, space lasers, hypersonic jets that could get. All of a sudden it starts to change the nature of what we mean in this case by warfare. So I like it because it's this directional thing, and it tries to paint a picture of a world that people would say, this is transformed things.
Well, I think there's a really good example. So firstly, I think what you were saying about Ukraine, what President Zelensky is currently saying about there will be no negotiation until the 1991 lines are re-established. Arguably, the recapturing of Crimea could be described as audacious, because it's certainly not 100% certain that the Ukrainians could do it. But I think in historic terms, there's a really, really clear BHAG for me would be Eisenhower driving the American people in 1941 to recognize that they can be the dominant military power. And if you look at where the US was in, and I don't think people recognize this very much unless you're particularly interested in military history, already a year into the war in Europe, and America is probably, they're a middling power at best. I think Portugal had a larger military force. Most of their cavalry was still on horseback, and yet in 2 years they became the world's largest and most powerful military nation, and that was all driven by Eisenhower's vision and leadership, and arguably the pulling together of a nation by one man's, big, hairy, audacious goal. And I think that, if you said in 1941, America is going to not only get to become the largest military power, but they're going to be, by a considerable margin, the largest military power, and then they'll keep it going for the next 60, 70, 80 years, everybody would have laughed at you.
Well, so I think, we should take a break in a second, but then I want to come back and talk about the 3HAG. But I agree with you. I go back to this idea of it requires a quantum step in capabilities and characteristics of the organization. If your BHAG is, we're going to do more of what we have done, or slightly better, or launch some new products, that is not a BHAG. Let's take a little bit of a break, but then when we come back, let's see if we can make the long term and the short term meet in the middle, and again, see where that goes.
Wonderful. I'll see you after the break.
Okay, welcome back. So just before the break, we talked a lot about the BHAG, and I think I want to go back and just give you those examples again, because I think they crystallize it really well. In fact, I'm just going to do one. SpaceX enable human exploration and settlement of Mars. Small, simple, clear statement, amazing in its ambition and how do we get there? But wouldn't that be astounding if we could do something like that? So BHAG, long-term, big, hairy, audacious goal. People talk in terms of 5 years. People talk in terms of 10 years. It's a long-term transformational statement. But as we pointed out, and we kind of dipped in and out before the break, you have to connect the short term with the long term. Well, how are we going to get there? What are the steps to get there? And this is the bit that I think becomes magical for a business. One thing is, wouldn't it be great? The next thing is, how are we going to get there? And so a lady by the name of Shannon Susko came up with a sort of an idea to layer on the top called a 3HAG. And let's see how good you are at guessing acronyms. Gareth, what is a 3HAG?
3HAG. So there's a potential that it means 3 H's, but I can't for the life of me think what that could be. But
what about HAG? Let's have.
Well,
so
is that a hairy, audacious goal?
So that the big one's the hairy, audacious.
Right. Well, it would be a SHAG if it was a smooth, audacious goal.
Yeah.
I don't know. know.
No, that's okay. It's just interesting to know whether these things sort of just make sense of the game. So a 3HAG is the 3-year highly achievable goal. One is, I don't know how we're going to make this.
Goal.
This one's the highly achievable. Okay, now all of a sudden, we have to start putting stepping stones in place. We have to start identifying, okay, if our mainframe costs $4 million, the first thing to do is figure out how it only costs $2 million. If it currently is the size of a house, let's get the sucker down to the size of a room before we get it. So 3-year highly achievable goal. And so she wrote a book called The 3HAG Way, and she described it as where the long term and the short term meet. And if BHAG is inspirational and almost impossible, the 3HAG is the real bits. And the highly achievable bit gives you a definitive target to aim for when you set out of the plan. And what's really nice, and I've participated and done this with an organization, which I found really useful. It's a way of breaking down the problem into 3 years of goals that get you to, or at least get you on the way. So again, to use the IBM example, go from $4 million to $2 million to $1 million to $100,000 to $1,000. There's sort of that element of how do you move it along. So
why is it 3 years?
That's I'm going to guess. I think it's because 3 years is something that's not too short and not too long. And in fact, the way all of these work is that the first year you is very clearly defined. In fact, we'll go on and talk about that a little bit later on, how we started with this amazing vision, which wasn't connected to reality. You then have 3 years, which is more detailed, and I'll talk about what sort of goes into this. But on the other hand, still a little bit of wibble, sort of flexibility and ability to change. But actually, then you can take it down to quarterly plans, and you can even take it down to weekly plans. And maybe we'll touch on that a little bit later.
It seems to me that we've talked about the link between strategy and tactics before.
Exactly.
And that strategy is, having the vision. It's not a plan, it's a general sense of where you're going. I've used my compass analogy. We've talked about tactics being the application of capability in real time to achieve tasks. So it's what we do in operations. What we haven't talked about particularly in the military is we bridge strategy to tactics with what we call operational art. And operational art is the understanding of capability and its effects over time. And we do campaign planning. So the idea of how do I get to what we're calling, my BHAG, my objective, the end of the war, the winning. How do I get there? How do I envisage that? And how do I work back from that into achievable chunks, whilst recognizing that I'm not designing a Gantt chart, because
exactly, that's very,
the enemy has a vote. Things aren't going to go to plan, and lots of things are uncertain, but everybody needs to know that they're contributing to that end goal now, and therefore there has to be this golden thread that says, what you're doing now is not pointless. What you're doing now is part of the wider plan. It's part of that move towards success.
Well, and I think you've touched on a couple of points there, which is, and nobody ever really does this. Hopefully nobody ever does, where you say, I can't plan because things change, and so there's no point in planning. That's not a useful answer.
Oh, I've come across people that do that.
Well, I suspect so. Luckily, not so many on my side. But the second thing is, you could take the equally not useful position of, here are the next 3 years in a Gantt chart, which but so I think this is the attempt to blend flexibility and iteration, but with a sense of, and this is where we're going. So I've used this analogy far too many times, sort of the Second World War. We are going to go to Berlin, everyone. That is what we are going to do. And the way we do this is in these steps. We're going to invade, we're going to throw the Germans out of North Africa. We're going to invade all of these activities, but each of them then is adapted over time as you recognize how things have changed. But still, we're going to Berlin, guys. That's not changing. We're going to defeat the Germans. We're going to defeat the Japanese. This I thought was quite useful as well, because part of the thing I said at the beginning of the podcast was a framework to try and make this more real. And I obviously don't be slavish to this, but I think this is useful. BHAG, pithy one-liner. 3HAG starts to now build the detail out. And so people talk about a 3HAG statement, a statement or sentence that describes our company in 3 years' time. What are we going to be like in 3 years' time? No numbers. Like, describe to me, well, we've got, instead of being 200 people, there's 10,000 of us. We're all around the world in every shop, where whatever it might be. Describe what it looks like in 3 years. It's almost a smaller version of the BHAG. Fiscal numbers. What do we want our numbers to be in 3 years' time? And actually this, for the work I was doing in the business I was, this was critical. In fact, this very much related to the world of private equity. We need to build the business to this size. And if we have this size business with this revenue, this is the outcome we will get, or our shareholders will get. So fiscal year numbers in 3 years' time. It could be revenue, operating costs, profit, cash, whatever it might be. In fact, many times it's all of those things. And then the one I quite like, this is sort of very American, I think, are widgets. How many widgets would we have to sell in order to achieve the fiscal numbers? Each one of these things peels back the onion a bit more, and someone in the room says, sorry, did you say we have to sell 10,000 of those? We sold 50 last year. Okay, we better think about what the world would look like for us to sell 10,000 of these things if you want that revenue.
Yeah.
3 to 5 key capabilities. I love this one. What is it either don't do today or would need to do differently in order to deliver these goals. And so there's a real sense of, rather than it just being, we're going to sell lots and build great things, we better build an R&D division. We better think about a group of people who can develop this technology, and we don't have that today. It's a whole new capability we have to build. And then the piece that flips in with that is, what are the critical organization capabilities that position you where to be achieved? And what that meant in our world was, describe what the organization will need to look like in 3 years to be successful. So what was fantastic was, it was, Chris, you're the VP of product. You have this many people working for you today. Describe the organization in 3 years that would mean you were successful. Now, clearly, the statement is, well, that's foolish. I can't predict. Yeah, I know you can't predict, but have a go. Start thinking about it, because a BHAG and then the 3HAG is much as about thinking about transformation. And then finally, because I can see this look, you want to come in on this. What do we want to be known for? So in 3 years' time, when we meet someone in the street and we say, we work for Acme Inc., what is it Acme Inc. are going to say about this? What are our customers going to say? Oh, Mike, 3 years ago, I used to buy a widget from you. Now, all of my widgets are your product, or without you, we couldn't rely. So there's some examples. And my particular experience was, we did most of those, not all of those. We put a few other things in. So don't get too caught up on, do we have fiscal numbers and widgets? But what you're seeing there is, it's describing a world where you're refining and refining. You're focusing the laser or focusing the light more and more, not just on wouldn't it be great if, into what must be true across all areas of our business for this to be true. So 3HAG, I'd love to get your sort of take on that and what that means to you.
Well, I think, firstly, we've just done a session on the value of red teaming and wargaming, and where you say, what's the world going to look like in 3 years? If you remember, I said that there are 3 reasons that you do wargaming. One is to stress test plans and ideas, and sort of identify areas where you've perhaps not put enough thought into it, and therefore you can go away and reinforce those plans and make them better, come up with contingencies. One is about building confidence in teams, expanding people's horizons. And one is about ideation, coming up with new ideas by exploring what the future might hold. And it's not gaze into a crystal ball and come up with what's the future going to be. It's conversations about trends. It's conversations about, if we do this, what will our competitors do? What will our suppliers do? What will our customers do? And it creates those conversations where you're suddenly not predicting what the world looks like in 3 years using some sort of magic, some sort of crystal ball vision. You're discussing logical trends and the steps that you would have to take to get the future to look the way you want it to look, and what challenges and opportunities might present themselves. And I think so we're just reinforcing the need to do that wargaming and red teaming.
Exactly. This none of this should be, in a sense, new. It's a way of putting it all together and describing it. And you said something there which I thought was interesting. And we've touched on this in the past, which is, I think I grandly said, there are many companies today that claim to have some genius strategy that some clever people had built. And it turns out, really, it was an emergent strategy. They observed what had happened. What I think is different about this is about shaping the future. This is not about saying, well, I'm going to be very thoughtful and I'm going to see what happens and I'm going to adapt to it, and from there I will get success. This is about saying, I am going to describe a thing I am going to drive towards. And of course I will adapt, but I'm going to get there. So today, well, actually before Elon Musk, there wasn't anyone saying, I am going to go to Mars and colonize it. That just wasn't, they either A, it wasn't something that they thought was interesting or exciting, or B, they would say, there is no technology that would enable us to do that today, come back in 20 years. This is about the BHAG, and then the 3HAG is about shaping and driving the future. But I want to talk about how you can then continue to take it even more granular. And that idea of shaping and forming, you start with a BHAG, and actually you can end up with, what is my team doing next week? And I don't know that I necessarily agree with that degree of granularity. I think there are challenges and risks, but literally the idea that you can say, this is the plan and we're going to execute on it and we'll adapt. But this isn't just aspiration. We are going to plan to achieve it. I kind of like that. Anyway, let's go back. British military. I don't know. I know that people talk about doctrine, and I think there was even a document that was posted recently about British military doctrine, or it might have been NATO doctrine. Is that an equivalent? Is there an equivalent, or is it sort of? What do you think?
So
It's interesting. You've got a slightly pained look on your face.
Yeah, I don't think there's an overarching BHAG. I think because of what the military is, there are lots of vision statements. There are lots of strategic outcomes, and there are lots of strategic missions. So there is a national security strategy that sort of lays out what British defence contribution to our national security is and what we need to be able to do, and that gets reviewed in the National Strategic Security Review every five or so years. But there isn't overarching an audacious goal. Having said that, I think within defence there are definitely bits of defence where there are these audacious goals. I'm trying to think of a very good example that listeners would understand.
But I think a really good one though. And the question is whether or not it was articulated. I think your point about the US Armed Forces in the Second World War. Yeah. I think that is an example of an audacious goal. If in depending on where you want to go in your history, let's say 1938, if you said to the United States Senate that in 10 years, the United States would be the single most powerful military force in the world, able to project power and defeat its enemies with technologies that had not been dreamt of, with unprecedented power, I think that probably is a reasonably good definition of a BHAG. Yeah. Maybe a different way of asking this. And I mean, and I don't know whether I was sort of interpreting this from what you said, but it almost feels like the British military is busy fighting the wars it's got to fight in the next war. And so, not being funny, Chris, the idea that someone's going to come up with a BHAG, that sounds like someone who's got consultants in would do. Do you think there's an element of truth in there that is?
I think so. And I think there's a risk with something like national security, where the range of threats is so wide that you can't focus on a particular, we're going to colonize Mars or we're going to get to the moon and back. And you've got to remember that was a moonshot for, the National Aeronautical Space Agency. That was a moonshot for NASA that enabled a whole load of fallout technologies that help US business innovate. It helped the US defense with a whole load of capabilities, but it wasn't a Department of Defense BHAG, it was a NASA BHAG. Yeah. And I think in the same way
presidential, in fact.
Well, absolutely. It was Kennedy's, wasn't it? In the same way that DARPA, so the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and ARPA before that is effectively the inventor of the internet, is probably the organization that has BHAGs for the US Department of Defense. But the Department of Defense doesn't have them on its own.
I see. Yeah, I think, and again, this is this idea of sort of breaking it down somewhere else. But I'm going to say something very, very dangerous, and I suspect anyone serving who listens to this will shout and wave their fist at the screen. Actually, is the military missing a trick? Because one might, and by the way, the reason why I think people might shake the fist is this sounds like a bunch of sort of fluffy consultancy nonsense that ignores the fact people are getting shot at in various places. But I'm going to challenge that by saying the risk is we're always chasing our tail. We're always, trying to figure out what the next war is. And again, this will be unpopular. It's all about cyber. It's all about cyber. It's all, oh God, there's lots of tanks and lots of people on the ground and they're fighting in trenches.
Yeah.
Cyber is important, but it turns out people on the ground. And so
absolutely. And I think
at one level, the military is eternally moving back. It's close quarter, it's insurgency, it's tanks on Fulda Gap. Is there an element of there will always be a need to support that? But is this a statement that says this is transformative in the same way that notionally the development of the nuclear weapon was transformative? We are going to develop something so awesome and powerful that countries will not fight because of the risk of this. So I think step change.
Yeah, you've got to see these things within the wider context. So the Manhattan Project was a BHAG, it was a big, hairy, audacious goal, arguably, and yeah, you could argue that it was a must as well, and it was a race, and there's all of that history to it. But it wasn't a BHAG for the US Army. It wasn't a BHAG even for the Department of Defense. It was a BHAG for a very subset.
Interesting.
Because if it hadn't worked, or if the Germans had got there first, we still needed a plan B. We still needed to be able to respond. So I think there's a point where you are having to, as you say, not put all your eggs in one basket and go, right, the future of war is cyber, and then suddenly find that you've exposed another flank, because that is the nature of conflict, is you are constantly trying to put your strengths against your adversary's weaknesses. So if they are going at 110% towards a particular goal, then all you do is adapt your strategy to pit your strengths against where they're not going. So there's this constant balance, and the late historian Michael Howard once said, the art of military sort of future gazing or prediction is not to be so accurate that you know what the next war is going to be, but to be close enough that when it comes, you're not going in the wrong direction. Well, so there's this idea of constantly balancing lots and lots of ideas. And then I think once you get into an operation, so we've referenced Ukraine a couple of times already, Ukraine doesn't now have that difficulty of deciding what the war's going to look like. It knows what the war is, and now it can probably set itself a big, hairy, audacious goal, which is we're going to recapture all of our territory, and at the end of it, be a stable democratic country that leans towards the West, which lots of people would argue is a big, audacious, big, hairy, audacious goal. I don't think they would have been in a position to state that, before the Russian invasion, and there would have been the potential for hybrid threats, the potential for the Russians just to leave them out economically. There would have been lots of things where actually setting a single goal is going to be particularly difficult.
By the way, people listening into this, hearing us going, look, that they're trying to poke the balloon, and every time they poke it, it comes out a different area. You're absolutely right. As always, as everything we're talking about, you can't be dogmatic. Hey, British military, stop doing everything and do a BHAG and your problems will be solved. But ridiculous. So there are big BHAGs and there are small BHAGs, and there's a slight. This always comes down to smart people using their best intention to use these tools and these ideas in the best way. I still think, and I still wonder whether there's a concept out there which is about militaries transforming themselves to be something that is beyond where they are today. And don't get me wrong, everything you've said, I agree. Ukraine, BHAG, don't be silly. But it's today, militaries can't be anywhere in the world in 30 minutes. They can't apply unlimited power. What that does is it says this will put us ahead of our competitors in a way that the tactical stuff becomes less important because they're powerless. I don't know. I'm right now, there are cleverer people who are in a much better place. We're coming towards the end, and I wanted just to finish with, we sort of started at the BHAG. We said, this is the big goal, the big, hairy, audacious goal. We then talked about 3HAG, about saying, okay, how do we break that down into sort of years, and how do we start planning? Actually, the last piece, which is worth maybe just more of a passing reference, is when we were doing this, you then went even more granular. So what you would actually say is, what is our quarterly plan? And so you could actually break it down into, in order to achieve year one's highly achievable goal, what do we do this quarter? Because everyone talks about quarterly planning and what are we working on right now. This is a way of having a direct strand from the BHAG, the 3HAG, to the quarterly. And then what we actually did, not successfully, but I think it was because we weren't able, well, for a couple of reasons, you then go from quarterly plans to a weekly plan. So if in this quarter, we are going to develop a piece of technology that does X, actually for the next 4 weeks, for the next 12 weeks, this is what the plan could look like. And this allows us to go. Now, personally, I get a bit nervous when it gets to weekly plans, because now it feels a bit like this thing's on rails. You know what?
Yes,
we're predicting 3 years ahead. Let's make it 5 years ahead. And by the way, Bernie, you're not allowed to take a holiday on year 4.5, because I think that's a bit silly. Likewise, I think the other risk, you can do it, and I know there are businesses that do this and are highly successful. The risk is you're now busy managing the plan rather than the result of the plan and the outcome of the plan.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a few things to unpack there, which is we sort of maybe got distracted about, is there an overarching BHAG for the military? And I'm sure people will have their opinions on that or not. But I think, as you said, it's a really useful tool for linking, for doing two things. One, linking long-term vision to current activity. And we've talked about before the idea of the operational art to implement the plan, but be adaptive to change as you go. And the second thing is about motivating people to feel like they are part of the change rather than the change has been implemented on them. Your point there about managing the management of the plan, and it becomes all about setting goals and testing and measuring, and actually you fail to actually get on and do stuff is a real risk. But I think there's a definite relationship between, as you're breaking that big, hairy, audacious goal, we're going to get to the moon and back, and I've just looked up the figures, the moon is 384,000 kilometers away, and at the time, the furthest away we got a satellite into space was about 600 kilometers. So we're talking about, orders of magnitude of complexity and technology change.
Problems they hadn't even imagined they needed to solve.
Yeah, absolutely. And so as you're breaking that down, I think it's really important to go back to this idea of empowerment of teams to then take on those chunks and further break those down and pass those down to their subordinate teams. And so you're back to this idea of mission command. You're back to this idea of, I will tell you what I want the end result to look like, but I'm not going to tell you how I want you to do it, because I don't know what you're going to come up against. I don't know what the intricacies of this problem are going to be. I don't know what problems are embedded within this challenge, because we haven't got there yet. So trying to roadmap it out is pointless. What we're going to do is make sure that everybody's capacity to work on the project is all aligned towards this end goal.
And there are a set of flags that point you in the direction of the ultimate goal, and the flags can move. Yes. You can move them around.
Absolutely, yeah.
I was listening back to something we said a few weeks ago about airsofting and people milling around. This is a terrible generalization. how many businesses have you worked with or met where it kind of feels like people are milling around? What are we doing here? We should sell more widgets. Apparently, we've got to sell 20% more widgets this year. Okay, more widgets. No. That's not going to drive to success.
And I've also been in businesses where, this idea that everybody understands the strategic vision, and we've said how important that is. And I've been in businesses where everybody does understand the strategic vision, but what they don't understand is what they're doing currently, how that contributes to it. So, you can go around and the CEO can say, what is it we're here for? And they say, oh, it's to, get every book that's ever been published online in 60 seconds, available in 60 seconds. But what are you doing to be part of that? How are you helping? Oh, I have no idea, because I fix light bulbs, or, I answer phone calls, and I'm not really part of that. I just do this. And that's where I think the 3HAG bit, the idea of, and I don't think, it's interesting that it's 3 years. I don't think it has to be. I think it would be relative to the project.
It's an arbitrary number which says far enough out that you can project where you want to go, but not too far. And more importantly, for me at least, the 3 years in itself is less important. It's the 3 1-year plans. It's starting to break it down into manageable chunks.
And it's the cliched example, but I'm going to use it. It's the janitors in the labs at NASA. They don't know how they are contributing to getting to the moon. They know how they're contributing to keeping the lab so clean that the scientists' results are going to be better when they're looking at developing better silicon chips. So you can tangibly say, how does what you do today help get to the moon? Oh, well, if I don't clean to a very high standard, there's going to be dust in the atmosphere, which is going to interfere with the results of these experiments, which means in 6 months, we're not going to have produced better silicon chips. And I've been told that if we don't have these silicon chips, we won't have the maths to be able to do the, return trajectories or whatever it is. So those 3HAG kind of flags in the sand are not, here's the roadmap. It's a calling. It's that call to action I talked about with John Cotter. It's the calling for individuals within a small sub team to achieve their goals, which are linked to the overarching vision. And I think we've kind of looped back around.
We really have. And so one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this was, for me, it passes the sniff test. If you describe it really quickly, describe where you want to go, break it down into 3-year chunks, break it down into smaller chunks, give someone something they can be passionate about. I think it's passed that sniff test pretty well. Well, look, we've been talking for a while now. Just before we go, I think go away and Google 3HAG and BHAG. There's loads and loads of content on the web where you can turn this into something really simple and really easy for your business. Again, it's another one of these kind of things. You could spend half an hour with a piece of paper or a Word document and you can get it for yourself. You can work with the teams. It's a highly practical, easy thing to implement. The second thing, you mentioned one of the BHAGs we talked about was going to the moon, and you talked about empowerment. I don't know whether we should be recommending other podcasts. I don't think it really matters because this is ours. If listeners haven't listened to a BBC podcast called 13 Minutes to the Moon, I highly recommend you do it, even at the risk that you will stop listening to us because you won't be able to stop yourself.
Well, I wouldn't go that far.
But I think the reason why I mentioned it was because you talked about empowerment. One of the things, it's an amazing podcast at the very heart of leadership. And it talks about the fact that people who went to the moon were 21. These were kids who were just out of university, and they were the ones and they were empowered to make decisions we would blanch at today. Go listen to it. So there you go. Last thing from our podcast today. Go listen to the podcast, but please do come back.
Well, look, thanks, Chris. You've introduced another concept or a couple of concepts that I've not heard of. I think they gel very well with the overall themes that we've been talking about. I'm certainly going to go away and do a little bit more research on these. And it's been, yeah, just another thoroughly enjoyable session, smashing around some ideas. So
Excellent.
thanks very much.
Well, look, everyone, as you know, we're on Twitter at Battling with Biz. We would love to hear from you. You know, we know we're building up a listenership out there. We look perhaps far too many times at the number of people who've downloaded and listening, but it's growing on a weekly basis. But please do share it with your friends. If this is interesting, please do let them know. We'd love to have more and more. And as I say, we'd love to hear more from you, whether it's at on Twitter at Battling with Biz. But we also, for those people who are not doing the Twitter thing, we also have an email address, which is battlingwithbusiness, and that's business spelled like business, at gmail.com. Please do let us know if there's anything you'd like us to talk about, ideas you'd like us to kick around, or frankly, if you disagree with us. But for now, thank you very much, Gareth, and we'll see you next time.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Goodbye from me.